answer these four, and then we'll take some more. We'll give them a chance to talk because it's okay. Let's do this now. Okay.
Well, thank you for the questions. But just about the first question, yes. I mean, in the last 3 years, we were witnessing an ongoing attacks on human rights NGOs, including like Jewish-dominated NGOs and the Zionist NGOs, like B'Tselem and Akri, Shuvrim Shtika, and there has been also have been targeted also by laws that basically are dictating some rules of ongoing reporting about their financial situation, etc. But specifically that if they get money from what the law called as foreign entities, they need all the time to disclaim that and to basically to make a statement about this, whether it's the Knesset or the publications. And it's clear that the NGOs that are affected by these laws, these are the human rights NGOs. And interestingly, by foreign entities, the Israeli law basically would refer to who are the foreign entities who are funding these NGOs. It's basically European countries, it's Canada, it's the European Union. So all of a sudden, these democratic countries who provide mainly support for human rights activities are becoming kind of like part of the enemies. But the idea, as we see it, is basically to delegitimize these human rights NGOs within the Israeli Jewish public, in order not just to delegitimize them, but in order basically to avoid any serious discussions about occupation of the 1967 Palestinian territories. So I think the main idea is not necessarily the human rights NGOs, but the issues that these human rights NGOs are working on, which is the issue of the illegal occupation of the 1967 Palestinian areas. I don't know if you have been following the last 2 days, when the representative of the B'Tselem made a speech in the Security Council, and he was heavily attacked by Prime Minister Netanyahu and all the ministers, as if you are not supposed to criticize Israel abroad in the UN Security Council. And so you would see that it's trying to silence the NGOs by trying to delegitimize them and saying, well, you go to the UN is against Israel, so basically you are kind of cooperating with the enemy. And this is a way how to silence these groups. And definitely this is like a dangerous change or dangerous move, even within the Israeli law. But this is an example of what I have been saying, that the anti-democratic process and the Jewishness process is still going on. And now it's not just reaching Palestinian citizens, but also human rights NGOs. About what responses do I hear from Canadian politicians, it's actually not different from what the responses that I get from American politicians. Not surprisingly. No real discussion about the issues that I just raised and I raised in these meetings. But it's merely to praise the negotiation as if there is serious negotiation. Everybody knows that there is no negotiation. And I would say that officials in Canada are very careful in this meeting. They are not making clear statements. Although, like today, we had a meeting with Hélène Lavendria, and I think she was but she's in the opposition, and she was very clear about her political views about the Middle East. the illegal settlements, the dangers of this, the expansion of the settlements. So at least when it comes, to the two-state solution with 1967 borders, you could see that, politicians here are still could speak, for it, but not to specify any action on the ground. So there's the statement about the, support of the two-state solution based on 1967, but there is no actual steps that are, being adopted on this. I mean, in Canada, as you know, Canada has not yet recognized even the Palestinian delegation as an embassy, or not even to have it as the delegation of Palestine. It's the Palestinian delegation, to try to avoid the word Palestine. So we still have a long way to go, also with the Canadian. The question about the refugees. I mean, I understand, your point of view, which I'm familiar with also from, colleagues in the left cabinet as well. But I thought that you will continue and tell me what you suggest. I mean, and first of all, what you suggest, and second, do you recognize the violation of the refugees' rights? Do you recognize the blight of the refugees' rights? Because one thing you could say that, well, I recognize the right, but I can't do anything about it. I mean, we're in a situation that there is no recognition even of the right and of the responsibility to that. So I wasn't clear where you stand, on this discourse. But obviously we have great disagreements here, and I would say it's a clear human rights disagreement. And when I address these issues internationally, I say that I would like that everybody to adhere to the United Nations decisions on that. Mainly I refer to the resolution of 194 as the framework that could solve the problem. But what I suggest is, if we have agreement on some of the other issues, and if we disagree clearly on the issues of refugees, I think that we should continue this dialogue. And I think that your support of a Palestinian state shouldn't be conditioned on me changing my mind about the refugees case. But unfortunately, that's the situation with some of my colleagues in Israel. They would tell me, well, if you recognize a Jewish state, I will recognize, a independent Palestinian state. Or if you give up the issue of refugees, I will support, the demand for a Palestinian state. But it's basically, again, I mean, that brings me back to the issue of, to compromise the human rights of the Palestinians. And as I said in my presentation, I'm not the one who's going to compromise the human rights. And I want everybody to be in my position, not to compromise the human rights. But if you still want to compromise the human rights, I just tell you, we should find the way how we could cooperate without you conditioning this cooperation of me compromise on my human rights values. About the merits of the question, we are 13 seats out of the 120. And, my dream would be to be influential in the Israeli politics, but that's not the reality. And having the agreement with merits or not, that wouldn't change, unfortunately, anything from the coalition now. Today you have the right-wing coalition that for the first time ever all the right-wing parties within that coalition. And according to the polls that we see in Israel, that's not going to change.
But what about the symbolic effect of saying we are not going to cooperate with the Israeli left, even if it's to the cause of the left?
But as an opposition, we say that all the time, that our main goal is to get rid of Netanyahu. And I have to tell you, one of my big disappointments so far in the Knesset was that there is no real opposition. I mean, I don't hear the voice of the leaders of the Labour Party, even when it comes to issues that they agree upon And you know, in my private conversation with them, some of them will say, yes, we want two-state solution, we would accept the Arab League initiatives. And when I told them, go and speak to your community and to your constituency, they refrain from doing that. So I think one of the problems that we are facing in Israel now, that the opposition voice is hardly heard. And in many cases, the main opposition now in Israel, it's the joint list. Sometimes mirrors. But altogether we're less than 20 out of the 120. So I think that our real challenge now is to create a real alternative. And in order to do that, some of the traditional, alternative parties like the Labour Party should speak loudly against the occupation, against the expansion of the settlements. But this voice is not being heard, and as long as this voice is not being heard, I don't see how the Jewish public will change their mind.
Okay. Another 3 questions, please. Madam.
Samiha Barakat, Canadian or Palestinian origin from Jaffa. I have a question of 2 parts, which you have replied. The first part, the thanks about how many, the percentage between the Jews and the Palestinian members in the Knesset, 13 to 100. Do this number have the right to use the veto right against any decision taken by the Israeli government, which is against the Palestinians or not? Thank you.
Thank you. Next here.
Hello, my name is Kevin Dooley. I'm a retired machinist, marine engineer, originally from Ireland, but I've been here a long time, I've been here over 40 years. And I have a background in the trade union movement. And what I'd like you to address, please, is I understand, and presentation, I thank you, and the presentation on the big picture and the human rights issues is very clear. I get that, and I'm sure everybody here does. It's very, very good. But there's another issue that I'm concerned about, is on the ground in Israel, the Palestinian population makes up about 20% of the population, you say, but from what I understand, they make up a huge chunk of the working class population here. And most of the people in the area are working people in various aspects of the economy of Israel. And from what I understand, they face real apartheid conditions. They face discrimination on the job, they face discrimination in hiring, in ghettoization of work, in housing. So it's not practical, everyday things for this population, which is, I don't hear being addressed. Now, these are situations, these are conditions that can be fought out and addressed within Israel. And again, like we mentioned, our brother here, talking about the Labour Party, talking about the left. So there are other conditions in Israel that are on the ground conditions of discrimination, apartheid style discrimination, as you see, that these have to be addressed and these have to be fought out too. So I'd like you to address that, please.
Thank you very much. Kevin.
Okay. Thank you for giving me the opportunity. My name is Ahmed. I'm a physician in Ottawa, Palestinian in origin. Maybe my situation summarizes the whole case. I am born to a Palestinian Jordanian father, Palestinian West Banker mother, and married to an Israeli Palestinian wife. Simple as this. I have 2 comments on what was said before. When talking about ethics of returning Palestinian refugees that will ruin the Jewish majority in Israel, if we apply the same ethics and same human rights principles as you asked for, how come I allow Jewish refugees to come back after 2,000 years to their land and change the demography in 1947 and vote for this, and I cannot allow the Palestinians after 50 years and 70 years of occupation to come back to their land and change the demography? If we allow 2,000 years to change demography, we should allow the Palestinians to change. And the second comment, sorry, talking about Netanyahu as if he is the only obstacle. I don't know, like if we have Mir Regev as the Prime Minister, or Avigdor Lieberman, or even Herzog from the Mahanet Zioni, it will not change anything. The problem in Israel right now, I see that the majority of the grassroots are morally radicalized. So I don't know what's your opinion about this. Do you think there is any hope for change in Israel from within? I personally don't see any hope when you have more than 90% of the population is the right wing. I don't know where is the left, because I cannot consider now the labor as left in Israel. It was traditionally left. Number two, the labor that consider themselves left, they were the first and the most building or extensive building of settlements in the West Bank was run by the Labour Party, not by the Likud Party. So, do you see any hope internally, or we should only rely on the external pressure in Israel to achieve some change there? Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I'm from Palestine, born and raised, 2 years in Canada. So I want to ask a couple of questions. First of all, occupation is not occupy your land. It's occupy your school, your language, your everything. It's basically let you feel a stranger in your own country. As one thing, as your party support two solution countries, I was surprised that you went up with one solution country as a secular country. So why both sides been afraid to talk about the solution? That's first of all. And as the first party in the Knesset, nothing been done on the ground. Why not putting your energy on organization, on the people on the ground that's make more power or something like that? Thank you.
Thank you. That's 4 questions. I think I'll take those 4 now. So Chris, if you don't mind, we have time, so you will get your kick in the can and head. And I think that's going to be the end of it once you answer these questions here. So please. No, those 2 answers. I think we're going to be close to our time.
Yeah, okay. Thank you again for the very important and challenging questions. The question about what power do we have in the Knesset, unfortunately we don't. Arab political representation is very formal. It's very formal in the meaning that, right, we participate in the election, we have our representative, now I'm one of them, but politics in Israel are not decided by the Knesset, are decided by the government, and the government has a majority in the Knesset. And even we are witnessing the process that the Knesset itself, like the parliament, is becoming very marginal because the government has had very tight control over all what's going on. So basically, we are in the opposition, and your question is basically important to emphasize that when Israel presents itself as a democracy, it's clearly that it points out to these formal characteristics of, right, we participate in the election. But do we really have a substantial political participation? Do we have any say in any of the decision-making processes? Of course not. So our political participation in the election doesn't mean political influence or political power. So we have been in the opposition, historically in the opposition, and it seems that we will continue to be in the opposition. And unfortunately, clearly we don't have any say and any influence in the decision-making circles. So when you speak of veto rights, that would be our dream in the far future. But even these issues are not discussed in Israel. Nobody will really think about veto for minorities. That's, we haven't even reached that point. We are still trying to overcome this wave of new anti-democratic laws and racist laws. So the way is still long until we reach substantial discussions about minority rights. About our community, we could speak hours about the daily discrimination in housing. That would be denied a house once you identify as an Arab, or you denied a work offer once the employer found out that you're an Arab, or the educational system, which is substantial issues that we face. The fact that our school is extremely underfunded. We are the poorest in socio-economic terms. We are the poorest community in Israel. The fact that our educational system is controlled by basic Jewish educators within the Ministry of Education, Jewish educators and Jewish intelligence forces. So our Palestinian identity is absent from the curriculum, and we end up studying more Jewish history and Jewish religious than our history and our narrative, which almost doesn't exist in the curriculum. One of my dreams in the high school was to study in a high school in Nazareth, because I wanted to study with a teacher who used to be a famous poet, Shakib Jahshan, his name. And then I got to that school and I got to be his student. But then I realized that his poems are not part of the curriculum. So I had asked him to stay like extra hours after we finished, just in order to get some sense of his writings. So definitely all the literatures and the poems of Mahmoud Darwish and Samih al-Qasim and Tawfiq Ziyad, all of that, all our main cultural and national icons, they are not part of the curriculum. And this process continues until today. And as I said, sometimes there is an acceleration of this process. The fact, for example, that when it comes to the citizenship study in Israel, the new government is now proposing a new textbook that adopts almost only the Jewish Zionist narrative. When it comes to Palestinians, they refer to them in terms of like sub-religious groups with no history, with no connection to the land, with no collective rights, etc., etc. So that's the education system. When it comes also to the status of Arabic, Arabic is recognized by law formally as an official language. That was like a mandate law that was adopted in Israel, but on the ground is not being implemented in none of the public services or none of the public authorities. In the Knesset, I could speak in Arabic if I want, but nobody will understand because there's no translation. Yesterday, we visited the Canadian Supreme Court. I was lucky to meet very interesting people there. And for me, it was really shocking and impressive to see how the French language is being respected, and that the court is bilingual, or the federal court is bilingual. You could speak one of the two languages easily. The decisions are delivered in two languages, and for me that was like another world. I could just dream of that Arabic would have similar status. You can't in Israel communicate with any of the public offices in Arabic. The signs are in Hebrew, and if you use Arabic, usually they use the Arabic letters, but the Hebrew names of the area. So I would say it's better to drop, this use of Arabic, because people might get used to the Hebrew name through the Arabic letters. So it's so Arabic as part of identity. So the absence of Arabic from the public sphere in Israel reflects the absence of the Arab identity from the public sphere. The question about the grassroots work and our representation in the Knesset, I don't think that this is conflicting tools of struggle, but I think each one should complement the other. I mean, being in the Knesset for me is a tool of resistance, but it's also a tool of survival. I mean, my community is very inferior socio-economic. It's discriminated against by law. So I feel that I need to take advantage of any possibility in order to survive and in order to continue my struggle. So I'm not going to the Knesset to celebrate being there, but again as a tool of resistance and of survival, understanding that I will be treated inferior even in the Knesset itself. However, I do also understand that being in the Knesset is only one element of other elements that should be part of our struggle, including mass mobilizations, NGOs, popular, non-violent resistance, peaceful demonstrations, etc., etc. So I see the representation of the Knesset as, as an integral part of broader strategies of struggle and of resistance. And also, it's important to note that for us as a community, being in the Knesset has importance beyond the Knesset. Sometimes we don't achieve that much in the Parliament itself, but we represent our community in the international arena. We do a lot of international lobby. We are also leaders, in the ground, in the field, with our people. And that's by itself also is important. I would say that the major work that we do as members of the Knesset is outside the Knesset, because the work in the Knesset is very limited. And let me just say this thing that, just about the question of being in the Knesset. I don't want you to think of a situation in which I sit in the Knesset and the Prime Minister Netanyahu, in an official speech from the podium, referred to me and to my colleagues at the Joint List, saying that you at the Joint List speech while I see the flags behind you. That's what he said. And for me that was, it's a terrible statement. I mean, how can a Prime Minister would allow himself to say that in a formal speech at the Knesset? However, there were no consequences to such a statement, and when we try to ask the Attorney General to do something about this incitement, we say that's part of freedom of speech. So we are not really enjoying the sitting in the Knesset. We are seeing this as I said, as a tool of struggle and of resistance and defending the rights of our community.
Thank you. There were two other people who wanted to make comments here. We have to go. We're at our time. I see what third person. Is that okay, Adam? If it's okay, if you could be very brief, please, so we can wind up on.
I will, Peter. My name is Chris Greenshields. I served as Canada's Minister Consular at the Canadian Embassy in Tel Aviv for some years, and more recently as Canada's representative to the Palestinian Authority. Mr. Shubaram, my question concerns the judicial system and Israel Supreme Court. You may know that Canada's Supreme Court has been very active in cooperating with Israel's Supreme Court, as well as many Canadian Chief Justices at Supreme Courts across Canada have been working actively with the Palestinian High Court. When Chief Justice Beverly McLaughlin visited Israel on a number of occasions, she spoke quite eloquently about Canada's experience in the recognition of minority rights. She didn't tell the Israelis what they should be doing, but she was trying to set an example. My question to you is, what role do you see for Israel's Supreme Court? Israel hasn't been able to agree on a constitution yet, ironically, over the issue of the nature of a Jewish state, I believe. And I suspect that perhaps the Supreme Court has been limited in this because of the absence of a constitution. But do you see hope in a role to address the kinds of issues that you have identified? And I'm very appreciative of that you took the time to come to Canada, because I think it's something that we need to hear. But I'd like to know how you see the Israeli Supreme Court.
And we got a great briefing yesterday at the Supreme Court for a couple of hours. It was terrific. Ed, you get the last question?
I hope it's not the last question, but it's obvious that nothing's going to happen within Israel. What is going to happen is response to the government outside of Israel, particularly Canada, the United States, Great Britain. And, most importantly, independent Jews have starting to voice, particularly here in Canada and in the United States. So I'm asking you, have you made contact with independent voices representing Jewish people who are willing to help? They do look at the injustices that are occurring in Israel to the Palestinians. The use of the term settlements, this is a bad trap to go into. These are not settlements. If you acknowledge them, you're acknowledging that these are welcoming inhabitants of illegal occupants of territory. Don't use the term settlement. You're falling into the trap.
Okay, thank you very much.
Oh.
Madam Secretary.
I just say, well, I always still want to answer the last issue about the issue of one state or two states. I would say that I wanted to present the issue from a human rights perspective. So for me, whatever political framework would work to guarantee equality for all, and dignity for all, and peace for all, I'm fine with it. The question, if it's two states or one state, become the question now of more doing politics on the ground. And I want to say that I still believe that two states is closer in terms of, of a practical matter. One state might be, as a theoretical model, more appealing today. However, I'm asking if we are finding that these difficulties in basically fulfilling a Palestinian state in borders of the 1967 borders, in which Israel would still have a Jewish majority, I guess it would be more difficult to try to implement a model or a solution in which, in one state where the Jews would be a minority. So I'm trying, when I think about one state or two states, I'm not addressing that from theoretical approach, but I'm trying to be more, more practical on this. So if the two-state solution now is basically getting that support from the international community, the UN, the EU, Arab and Muslim countries, so maybe we should give it still a chance in the coming few years. But I understand that it might be an illusion, and in a few years the illegal settlements will be everywhere. It won't be really possible to have a two-state solution. But that, not sure, will bring us closer to the one state, the one democratic state. It might bring us closer to the one Jewish colonial Zionist state. The question about the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is not taking a leadership role anymore within the Israeli system. It used to be more active in the late 90s and the beginning of the last decade. But the Supreme Court itself was under attack by Netanyahu's government. And I feel now that because of that attack, which was similar to the attack on the NGOs, now the Supreme Court is basically being retreated from taking any serious steps when it comes to these issues. When it comes to cases related to the occupation of the 1967 areas, I have to say that the Supreme Court has been playing actually a role of just approving all of the Israeli policies. So when it comes to the occupation litigations, the Supreme Court has no role. It basically has approved the Israeli policies, including the settlement, which is clearly illegal and according to all international standards. When it comes to issues of equality within Israel, as I said, part of these inequalities are by the law. So the Supreme Court has nothing to do, because the law itself creates this discrimination. And the court has no authority even to change these laws, because these are most of them, old laws before the Constitution era. But now we are witnessing that even when it comes to some basic issues, the Supreme Court is trying to avoid getting into quote-unquote troubles with the government. And one case from the coalition said that we should go ahead and destroy the Supreme Court in one of the cases that he didn't like the decisions. So if there is no respect these days from Israeli politicians for the role of the Supreme Court. The last question about reaching out to Jewish voices, we're trying our best. We're trying our best, and I agree that the solution these days might not come from within Israel. We are looking for some kind of outside solution. That would include definitely international pressure, UN Security Council intervention. That would include an increasing role of the ICC, of the International Criminal Court. That might include an increasing pressure of BDS, especially when it comes to activities in the West Bank and Gaza. And I would end by saying that with all due respect to all this external pressure, things will not change if Palestinians on the ground, on the street of the main cities, are not taking a leading role by mass protests and mass marches and mass resistance. I think that the hope would come by serious mobilization on the ground, which unfortunately is not really being witnessed in the last few years. And there has been like a serious critic that the plight of the Palestinians is not being reflected in recent years by mass mobilizations and marches on the ground. Thank you.
The end of our time, I'm going to ask Catherine Katzler to thank our speaker. Before I do so, I want to just say a couple of things. First of all, a number of references were made to Independent Jewish Voices, which has a book table at the back. There are also olive oil and zaytun products that are available at the back. We want members to join us at the Canada Talks Israel-Palestine. So if you're interested in knowing more about it, please come and see me afterwards. I know that some of you, since you heard what Dr. Jabreen answer some questions, now want to give even more money, so there's a possibility on the way out to make further donations, and we appreciate it all. Catherine, please thank our speaker.
We as Canadians have little understanding of Israel in general, and we have even less understanding of Palestine and of Palestinians. Tonight, we have learned a great deal. We have also learned from you about the importance of human rights for all peoples, whether indigenous or migrants to a country. For this we say thank you. Our mission as members of CTIP is to help Canadians better understand the history and current challenges facing those living in Israel and Palestine, and to advocate for Canadian policy based on human rights and equality. I think that tonight we have heard a message of peace and a message of the importance of human rights for everyone in order to achieve that peace. You have brought us a message that applies equally well in Canada. We appreciate your thoughtfulness and the challenges that you have given to us. And on behalf of everyone, I would like to present you with this small token of appreciation so that you can take a little bit of Canada back to your homeland. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you all very much. Dr. Jabreen will be here for people who want to follow up with conversations. I'm here with cards, and Catherine has her pockets open for donations. Thank you to all the volunteers tonight. You did a terrific job, and have a good evening, everybody. Thank you so much.